Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case may be, to listeners of Regeneration podcast, the viewers of this YouTube. And every maybe third episode, I remind people that you can find us over at Spotify. If you're watching us on YouTube, we began with more podcast than YouTubes. Now we see more YouTubers than the podcast at Spotify, Podbean, I believe Apple and others. And so here we are with Michael Martin and I. We're the ones with you today. We've got a subject we're going to bring up, and it's a subject that pertains to the beginning of people in the Catholic fold. The beginning of the liturgical year starts in a few weeks. It ends with the Solemnity of Christ the King and starts with Advent, which is considered New Year. But Michael, last week, I flew solo with Guido Preparata without you. I'm sure some of our listeners, they heard that your mom was in the anteroom of death, and tell people where you are and how you're doing. I'm sure there's
she died that day. So last Wednesday, when I woke up, and I had to go teach that day. So usually I get her up and dress before I go to work, but she was not in good shape. So in fact, she was sliding off of her wheelchair, so I had to pick her up bodily and put her back in bed.
Oh, no.
And she didn't leave that bed until she was done. But it was actually a beautiful passing, and actually it bears well on our topic for today, because my sisters were here. My brother didn't make it in time. He was on a flight back from California. He didn't quite make it. But my sisters were here. Most of my kids were here. Most of my sister's kids were here. So it was a full house. And as she was dying, my sister called me into the room around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we went in there, and we're all standing around the bed, and we knew we needed to pray. And the closest thing I had to me was the 1945 edition of the Book of Common Prayer.
Wow.
So I turned to the rite of burial, and we did some of the prayers from there, and it was beautiful. I mean, the language is beautiful anyway. And we were there as she took her last breath, and it was surprising to me, because I'd never been present at somebody's death before. I mean,
oh, really? Huh.
I'd been there right after, but never present when they died. And we accompanied her on the entire journey. I mean, she's been living with me for 7 years.
7.
And it was interesting. So as she died, I mean, before she was dying, she was kind of looking straight up, as if something was opening up there.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment she died, my sister was in the back of the room by the door, and she thought she heard somebody come in the house, and she went to go make sure the door was shut. They were having flies get in the house if people left the door open, but the door was shut, so it opened and shut at the moment she died.
Yeah.
So it was really beautiful, and for all of us, it was a beautiful experience. And then, and there was a lot of tears, as you can expect. But an hour later, just about everybody was on the front porch, and it was about 70 degrees that day, which is rare for Michigan at this time of year. And they're all drinking whiskey and wine and listening to the Water Boys. So
that's the actual wake.
It was an Irish wake for sure.
Is I've never looked into it. We know what wakes are. Does the derivation of it come like in the wake of death?
No,
that you were in the wake of, or no?
I really can't remember. I think
when yours happened so soon upon her passing, that I thought, like, what a beautiful image if you think of a wake of the boat or something.
Well, an Irish wake
thing behind, yeah.
They would like Finnegan's Wake, right? The famous book by James Joyce is the it's kind of vigil you keep over the body in case he's not dead.
Okay.
Right? So, and it was a while before the hospice nurse got here to pronounce her officially dead. And it was, so we went from sorrow after her passing, I mean, and joy, because she had been suffering from dementia for 9 years.
9 years. Wow.
It was not fun. And so she passed, and then there was all this out breath and relief and joy and laughter. And then when the undertaker finally came at about 9:30 in the evening and brought her through the room, we prayed over her again. It was again a moment of sorrow. And I had to tell the cousins, I was like, all right, guys, the Undertaker's here. Get back into character, because they were still in fun mode. But it was a beautiful experience, the entire thing.
Yeah.
And it happened at home,
Yeah. Yep.
which
How
is
lucky were you?
well, and I think, death, and we're going to talk about the festivals today. Death is also a festival in that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And what surprised me though is that it felt so much like a birth.
Mm-hmm.
Because I haven't been present for any, besides this one, any deaths, but I've been present for lots of births,
Yeah.
as you can imagine, with
Yep.
9 kids. And it felt like the same kind of energy that happens with the arrival of a child.
Yeah, I can't disagree. Having worked with in Catholic Church ministry for so many years, when you mention, kind of putting on your demeanor again when the undertaker came,
Mhm.
but not being a priest, obviously don't say the funeral mass, but I've done a lot of those. Quite often they're prayers at the funeral home or prayers before the taking of the body for the
Yeah.
funeral mass and the burial. And I've always seen that you use the metaphor of a birth, but there's a breathing process that continues, like times where you're with a larger community, times where you regather, like at the funeral
Yeah.
home before the body goes to the church. It's the family again,
Right.
and it's a great time for an in-breathing. And boy, you and I know how to beat up on the current state of the church, which seems to be in rigor mortis. But some of these things have been handed down. These liturgies, these festivals of dying. There's some beauty in the Catholic rites of burial, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's
No
again
denying
part
that.
of life in one sense. Well, my deepest condolences.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll continue to pray for your mom and for the family. May she rise from glory to glory. And again, let's. You said it's something of a festival. Today we're going to talk about festivals. We're a few weeks away from Advent. I know you, having been a former Waldorf instructor, um, I've thought about these things too. You might see new possibilities. Again, being so kind of tied to the institutional Catholic Church, I see where some of these, what they call ossification theory, right?
Right.
We had a guest on, let's start with maybe Advent and Christmas a little bit, but we had a guest on a few weeks ago, Mark Vernon. And I want to point people to, if you Google his name and Google, say, Mark Vernon, Blake, and Christmas, we know that Steiner and some others, were seminal into like reconceiving our festivals, but in the best sense of, I would say, tradition, not even breaking tradition.
Right.
An honest tradition is alive. But Mark Vernon used William Blake to kind of look at Christmas, and another one, Easter. And I don't know if I've sent them to you, Michael. They're very riveting in what he does with Blake's artwork. But Blake, when he looked at the modern Christmas, it wasn't consumer Christmas per se, but he wondered how even we celebrate the idea that this far distant God, that's a part of it, like comes and becomes a helpless baby. And right or wrong, Blake said, how crazy is that? Like, where did we ever think that God was so distant? And what something we see in Steiner too is that maybe these festivals can have an evolution in our time. If the infant in the manger has us like kind of looking back, especially with the Dickens Christmas,
Mhm.
and looking back and being all nostalgic, right? Nostalgia can be the mask of memory. Memory is a fructifying sap that is supposed to push us forward to open up like leaves to the new. Can Christmas ever devolve and ossify into something that's kind of cryogenically frozen after a long period of nostalgia, which is, nostalgia. Oh boy, the Romantic poets, as you know, had such a field day with the difference between the fructifying force of memory and nostalgia, which can keep us infantile. So these are some of the categories I think we need to bring to a reexamination of all of our festivals. And the danger, it seems to me, these are questions I'm having for you. It's like you're the guest, Michael, and hopefully then you can just kind of set off on some of this and we'll re-engage. But this notion too that we can think about festivals. One of my biggest wars is on the tyranny of the left brain, but there's got to be a huge danger in pretending we can reconceive festivals. Or on the other hand, what does it mean? Like you're doing at your home on Michaelmas. Our viewers have listened to this. How do we how did festivals ever happen in the first place? And all of a sudden people fell into fits of madness by celebrating these wonderful Christmas festivals.
Well, how do they
These are all
stop?
mysteries.
That's
Go
a
ahead.
bigger
Yeah.
question.
Amen.
How did they
Amen.
stop? Well, I'll tell you how they stopped. Well, at least in my doctorate's in English literature, so I'm really acutely aware of how it stopped there. Well, it stopped there with the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, and that's
Right.
where who
That
was
was
our
the
guest?
first.
Ronald Hutton. He on his book was
That
heavy
was,
on that.
that was the first war on Christmas. Was the
Yeah.
Protestant war on Christmas?
Mhm.
Which, unless it was on a Sunday, you couldn't celebrate it, and businesses had to be open. Now, ironically, Christmas is the one festival that the secularists can't let go of because it's good for the economy.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God, which makes me sick to my stomach. But
And
yes,
I would say too, it works when it's trapped in this hopeless nostalgia mode. It's not a threat. People talk about consumer Christmas. All that language sounds so tinny right now.
You're right.
But it's
Well,
true. But
that suffix algia means sickness, right? It's a sickness. Yeah. And that's so part of it, I think, is the Protestant Reformation, which disenchanted so much of the Christian year, even though it persisted. But I think the other thing is, and I think this is so important, that the festivals can't be festive unless they're connected to the seasons.
mm-hmm.
And I know that's different in the Southern Hemisphere than the Northern
Tara
Hemisphere.
Thiek, our guest, and we'll have her on again. She thinks this is a real problem that we have to surmount. Chesterton famously, he took a trip to Israel, I remember, and it was during Christmas, and it actually snowed. And for some reason, I just thought, like, that works too easy for Chesterton, that he could play with some of these Western kind of Northern Hemispheric themes. But let's just stay on that for a second. We didn't talk about that problem. It's been a big one for me too, right? That our Easter imagery is tied to spring. We want to connect it to that. But what do we do with the fact of the Southern Hemisphere?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not even going to try to guess, because I do not know what it's like to live in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Never been to the Southern Hemisphere. So I think that is, and I that's really problematic for sure. For if you're a Christian in the Southern Hemisphere, do you flip the festivals around? I don't think so, but I think there is something where it gets connected to the seasons as they happen where you are.
Yeah.
So Michaelmas will not be a harvest festival in the Southern Hemisphere, where it is here, right? Right. And maybe it takes on a different coloring. But I think, I'm trying to bloom where I was planted, and I was planted in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just thought, like, Tara brought it up. Do you remember her bringing that up last time?
Yes.
And I've always thought about it, especially when reading Steiner. And I tend to agree with you that, like, let's be honest, the way that we might think about prophecy, you could have a prophet or astrology that gives you these kind of symbols of nodal points, maybe in a web with nodal points going towards the center. But until you reach that nodal point, the imagery could be different until the reality meets those kind of prophetic symbols. And I think the same thing is what you were alluding to, that that there's different symbols that could weave around the Easter festival that capture, that we could illuminate each other, like a triangulating on something. The Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere triangulate on the mystery of Christmas, and it reveals something for both of us.
Well, what I think is important, though, is that when you start talking about these things, you're dealing with a poetic metaphysics, not a geocentric metaphysics, right?
True, right.
So that's what's important about it, and that's why I'm saying, when I say I don't know what it's like to live in the Southern Hemisphere, and if I did, I'm sure I would have various insights about how that happens, or how do people celebrate those things there. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I think what you mentioned, Steiner, and this book as well as I do, The Four Seasons and the Archangels.
Yeah.
Which I think you could definitely apply that to the in-breathing and out-breathing of the earth, which he talks. It's a big theme for him in that text, right? Where that's, even though it's opposite in the Southern Hemisphere than it is in the Northern Hemisphere, you can see it. You can see it. right? So that's important, and to
Walk people through
realize.
that cycle, and it's also, you can buy it. Owen Barfield translated it into English.
Did he do
Steiner's
this?
really genius book, Calendar of the Soul, which is
Oh
related
yeah,
to that,
right,
similar. Yeah.
right.
But at Christmas time, you reach the maximum in breathing.
Yeah, because,
Yep.
well, in a way, you can think of Christmas or the winter solstice is that in the northern hemisphere, where all the forces of the earth are drawn into the earth. So in a way, Steiner says the earth is most alive at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And at St. John's Day or near the summer solstice, it's the farthest of the out breath.
Yeah.
And it's interesting if you watch, and this is part of it for me. I'm a farmer. So until St. John's Day, the plants grow straight up. And then after St. John's Day, they kind of do this chaotic explosion, like fireworks in a way, and then eventually by Michaelmas, which is in September, and at least in the Northern Hemisphere, they cut themselves off from the earth, and they've given themselves all the way over to the seed. Because once the seed's produced for annual plants, my job is done, right? He must increase while I must decrease. And so it's important to be attentive to this, and I don't care where you are in the world. There are agricultural traditions that were married to the church year on these various festivals, and this in-breathing and the out-breathing. And I mean, if you look at the solstices,
so Christmas
and
would be the height of like interiority.
Yes.
That we can even look again with the culminating symbol of Christmas being, the birth of the light in darkness, something again that's more William Blake than most of the rest of the Catholic tradition, which seems to, I was reading this week that just like we had Guido Preparata on last week when we couldn't have you on, and he really struggles with this notion of theodicy, and the notion that we have from Augustine, how pale and limp-wristed it is, but that evil is the privation of the good.
Right.
That Plato kind of doing the exact opposite of the pre-Socratics, Parmenides and Empedocles, who really saw that you had to go into the darkness and find light. He thought like that everything should be done, there's nothing good to come from dreams for the most part. Same thing with Aristotle. That day was simply, the not night, and that night didn't have any purpose intrinsic to itself. And yet I think the Catholic Church, when the gospel got wedded to Greek conceptual thought, so many of the insights, think of Christ and the harrowing of hell, but it got grafted onto this kind of classical Greek conceptual thought, and it lost this real poetry. And God bless Steiner and William Blake that say that, the sun rising in darkness, or give me better Steinerian language, but in the midst of darkness, you look for the light within the darkness, like you're entering that. This is much more profound than
the sun
just
at midnight,
turning backwards to the baby in the manger. Sure.
By the way, speaking of the sun at midnight, I happened to get up very early this morning and see the lunar eclipse.
Wow.
Which was
on election day.
And then it got cloudy. About half an hour later. But
our
I did
listeners can go. Yeah, Michael made some prediction on his blog about election day and the lunar eclipse that we can start seeing.
And we'll see how I do. Yeah. But and I made them several weeks ago, so
that's right.
I didn't have
to vouch for that.
I didn't have to look at punditry late in the game.
Yeah.
But well, now here's the thing. So for me, this idea of celebrating the festivals in a living way certainly was related to my experience as a Waldorf teacher, but I was interested in it far before that.
Right.
Because I was, like you, I had the Catholic school parish experience, which was almost entirely deadening.
I opted for mine, it was better than the people who went to public school for me. That like our Halloween, I just remember as being somewhat magical, that it was tied to All Saints. May Day was another one that, like, if our church didn't have 70,000 lilacs in it,
Yeah, I love that. The May crowning, that was
yeah. So there were good elements. So I feel privileged that I had what I had, but it was probably still desiccated in comparison with what came
especially as I got to be, my late teens, early 20s, it just seemed dead to me. That it was divorced from something, and I didn't quite know what it was, and I figured out it's the cosmos is what it was divorced from in general.
I agree.
And so at that time, I think one of the things I got really interested in, I found it as a used bookstore as a young 22-year-old or something, is a copy of The Golden Bough by Sir James
It's
Fraser,
going to teach us a lot. Yeah.
which we talked about with Ronald Hutton a little while ago. And even though I could never really get with his thesis, his research is fantastic. And he had all the, he told him what people did at these different festivals. And I just happened to pick it up today. And this just random, I just opened the book at this page. In Bohemia, the custom of beheading the king is observed on Whit Monday. A troop of young
the
people
Monday after
disguise
Pentecost.
themselves.
Yeah.
Each is girt with a girdle of bark and carries a wooden sword and a trumpet of willow bark. The king wears a robe of tree bark adorned with flowers, and his head is a crown of bark decked with flowers and branches. His feet are wound about with ferns. A mask hides his face. And for a scepter, he has a hawthorn switch in his hand. A lad leads him through the village by a rope fastened to his foot, while the rest dance about, blow their trumpets, and whistle. In every farmhouse, the king is chased round the room, and one of the troop, amid much noise and outcry, strikes with his sword a blow in the king's robe of bark till it rings again. Then a gratuity is demanded. And he goes on. But you read that stuff, and I would just love hearing about this stuff. And I also, as I mentioned with Ronald Hutton, one of my introductions, probably the introduction to that, was when I read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot.
Okay.
And in one of his footnotes, he refers to Jesse L. Weston's book From Ritual to Romance, which is about the Arthurian legend, which actually was my introduction to Arthurian literature as well, which also draws on this Fraserian agricultural mythos, kind of applied to Christianity, but really the argument is that it was before Christianity, which I'm sure it was, but I think Christianity also does this, right? Pardon me. So I was really interested in this stuff as a young man, and I would read. I wasn't really a scholar at the time, but I would go to used bookstores and I'd find books about it. And I have one here called "British Popular Customs, Present and Past," which is a reprint from a book from the 1860s. So I got a bunch of this junk. And I loved reading about how they would celebrate these festivals in particularly in the British Isles, but all through Europe, and wonder what the heck happened. Why do we not do this stuff? This sounds like fun, right? And we're not only disenchanted, but we're kind of reductive. We're down to bare bones, right? Christmas and Easter, right? That's it.
Yeah.
Right. And you ask most Catholics, even when's Michaelmas, they can't tell you.
And Catholics, so many of our converts, they come in so excited to have the liturgical year, but then they find 2 years into it that they were left purely to their own, that there's nobody supporting them in this. Just think recently again, one little tangent, there was an article I read, a scholar, I'd like to have him on the show sometime. His name is Christian Roy. He's up in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
But he's a scholar of Spengler, Oswald Spengler, and some other things. But tell me if you agree or disagree, but I was thinking of how in our diocese and in all dioceses, the cup is gone because of COVID and it's not going to return. But it took me back to when, in the relatively early centuries where this fear, and I'm going to get into the festivals and the male-female polarity here. Good. But, all of a sudden this worry that a drop of the precious blood could spill or a crumb from the loaf, but especially the drop, that was very feminine, just like the women, we always want to map them, right? But the women they blow away maps. The whole feminine symbolism is pulsing with divinity, water, the whole question of Bergson, trying to how do we capture water philosophically? So the cup is taken away. One other thing that this guy wanted to tie in, and I think it has to do with the decline of festivals, is that he saw haggling in the marketplace as a very feminine thing, right? Discoursive, conversation, of flowing between, versa in the word conversation. But all these things are kind of dancing with each other. We lose the haggling price for the fixed price of the market. Right. And we had Michael Baywins, who was on some months ago, mentioned the connection between purgatory accounting books. Well, accounting books and purgatory.
Yeah,
You
no
couldn't
kidding.
have
Yeah,
one without the other. And then the Grail legend comes up. The cup is removed, the Grail legend comes up, and you get these themes of, the wasteland. And you
right,
mentioned T.S. Eliot, a land that has to be restored by imagination. This question of the Fisher King, what are you going through?
right.
And then, with Vatican II or whatever, the cup comes back. It's who knows? And now with the complete left brain tyranny of the COVID nightmare, the church again giving up the cup, and it's not going to return.
Well, it's interesting I think we're gonna talk to our Grail country peeps in a couple weeks,
Yeah.
but the Grail literature, disappearance of the cup, that actually arose at the time of the Fourth Lateran Council when the cup was definitively withdrawn from the faithful.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like these things.
That was Aquinas's
yeah.
deal, right? So it disappeared. And I think what happened is when they
say more about it being Aquinas's deal.
well, that was one of the things he argued that it's not necessary to commune in both kinds.
Yeah.
For the faithful in particular.
And is that connected with his, like, again, we love Aquinas, but he was like notoriously bad on women. I can't say again.
Yeah. Well, I think
Guido was on last week, and he threw out the whole Thomistic corpus, by the way.
I
think he's right.
I think he's right. But I think the problem is that it's reserved. As we grew up, right, in the church, it was reserved only for the priests. Mm-hmm. We get the cup. You don't get the cup. Never made sense to me. I mean, intuitively, it doesn't make sense, right?
No.
Doesn't make any sense at all. But I think what happened is Crusaders, when they were going to the East, they encountered the Orthodox or the Eastern liturgy, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, where you can't withdraw the chalice from the faithful. Mm-hmm. It's impossible because the holy bread comes out of the chalice. It's immersed in the wine, right?
Yeah.
So you can't do that. So that I think part of the Holy Grail mythos was a working out of that, and the idea that it was lost, right?
Has the Orthodox Church, did they take any hit with this during the COVID stuff? I wonder.
Well, they got weird. They you had to bring your own spoon or something. I don't know. Yeah. It was kind of weird. Yeah, I don't want to talk about it. It makes me mad. Because this was and I think what you just talked about, it's holding the Eucharist hostage.
Yeah, for sure.
That's wrong. It's wrong. I mean, wine anyway. It's it's alcohol. It cleans everything anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously.
People have said, I think medical doctors have said, of the two species, the danger of cross contamination is greater with
absolutely
the bread than the cup, for sure.
But here again, it's so, and this is an example of the left brain thinking you're talking about, right? This is not poetic metaphysics. So going back to the idea of the festival. So, and here's the thing, right?
Okay.
So for me, this had everything to do with Bonnie and I deciding how we were going to raise our children. Right? How do we celebrate the festivals? Because you don't know, right? And what is authentic, and how can you provide your family with something that's real instead of something that's kind of packaged? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And one godsend was my exposure in Waldorf education to the way Rudolf Steiner was kind of reimagining doing the Christian festivals. Not in a nostalgic way, like moving backwards, but in a way to move forward, but to not lose what was celebratory and sacred at the same time. Kind of like we did with my mom, right? So at the Waldorf school, that mostly happened with Easter. When I was there, it happened with Christmas, but the big ones were May Day and Michaelmas, right? Which were just wonderful celebrations. And when I stopped being a Waldorf teacher, I'm like thinking to myself, well, and the problem with that in a Waldorf school is becomes
Martinmas was pretty big for you, right?
Martinmas is big too, but it was it was a boutique kind of thing. It's not something that lived in the community. It was just kind of this museum thing that went on at the school. Isn't it charming? You know what I mean? But you wouldn't see anybody doing that outside of the context of a Waldorf school. So, and I was like, well, like I'm not teaching here anymore. My kids aren't going here. You know, if people aren't going to use this, I'm going to take it back. So we started doing here on the farm, which has been enriching. And then what happens is it starts to enrich the other festivals.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, you know,
Which is important too.
and you find ways to celebrate all through the year. You got, you know, and you find different ways. And the thing is, and this is, I was looking for this book and I must have gotten rid of it or lost it or it got wrecked years ago. You know, I mean, it's good to have the kind of philosophical or theological understanding of it, like that you get from Steiner, for instance, but that's not going to do any good in dealing with actual people in the actual world.
Right.
So, I mean, with children in particular, and this is Tara has been egging me on to write a book about stuff for kids like this, and I think I was thinking about this today. This might be the book I need to write one of these days. Is one on how to do the festivals. Pardon me. And so you look for ways to install this. Now, for me, part of it is these resources I get from like Robert Herrick, how he would do it in his he phrases it in his poetry, the celebratory attitude he has. But and even in the Golden Bough, not that we're doing these beheading rituals, but we do little things. But the thing is, how do you make it relevant today and not like a Renaissance festival deal, right?
Cosplay,
and moving into the future,
and
it's and this is where. So here's the thing, right? So you can have it outside of the context of the church year. So even though at a Waldorf school, it's not a Christian school necessarily, right? But it's outside of the context of a faith community. It's a school community, right? So I think that's why it's kind of just stuck there in a kind of almost museum atmosphere, and it's not living in the outside of that small environment. On the other hand, you can get the kind of antiseptic approach to it that you find, or not, that doesn't even exist. So where the church is disconnected from the cosmos, or the parish is disconnected from the cosmos, so it doesn't work there either. Right. So how do you bring these things together and make them live? And it's
$1 million question. Yeah.
But I think the thing is, you just do it, and it has to be a union of these festivals with a liturgical practice. That's and when they're united, then it becomes, I think, a living tradition. But what are the things you do to make that alive? And especially for children, right? And my kids get told. I mean, they're getting a little older now. My two youngest are 11 and 13, or I'm almost 12 and 14, but they're totally into it. When one festival ends, they're like, "Okay, what's the next one? What's the next festival? We got to get ready." And so after Michaelmas, which was September 29th, we celebrated a couple days before. We had Halloween. We were preparing for All Saints and All Souls Day. But we had a Halloween thing in the barn, which is a lot of fun. A few families came, and it was also very connected to. In fact, I told the kids. So I said, what would happen in some old places where on All Souls Day they would have a big bonfire, and they would burn the clothes of the people who had died for the last year. Kind of a reminder that
that's a good.
They have to move
I never
on.
heard of that. Yeah.
And so after my mother died, My son said, "I'm going to burn Grandma's clothes down."
Right. Yeah,
And I
very
said, "Well, we
tactile,
would,
little
but
boys.
there's a lot of polyester in that wardrobe. I think we
Yeah,
might just donate it."
out of the
But
mouths of babes. No, but I get it. Anybody can see that how that would be immediately gripping to like young boys. You know.
yeah. But how to, I mean, how do you do this? I mean, one of our favorite things that we do that's not Michaelmas in a May Day is we really celebrate the 12 days of Christmas,
Uh-huh.
which is ever since we started doing that, that's time of the year has become so much, not magical is not the word, but alive might be the
Yeah.
better word.
Right.
So we celebrate all the days between Christmas and the Epiphany or the Theophany, and we chalk the door. I don't know if you chalk the door.
Yep,
We
yeah,
make
yeah.
we're
For
pretty
the
elaborate
Epiphany.
about the way we do it, and we have a big 12th night feast with the bean cakes and the whole bit. And it's a bunch of people come and we sing songs and recite poetry.
Let me interject something here when you
Feast.
mentioned 12th night too, is that because we're still saying like, how does it happen? So in our little community here south of Rochester, we have we're blessed on the dairy farms to have and in various industries around here, but we've had a lot of Mexican and Puerto Rican immigration. I'm thinking of uh, this whole like obsession with Victor Orban kind of leaves me dry. But something that was interesting that was pointed out to me is he spoke at, I don't know if it was CPAC or something, but he was challenging people on the conservative side of the spectrum to say, the craziest things you guys are doing is being hostile to this Mexican immigration. He goes, I would be welcoming it with open arms. So these people still have vitality, um, and a connection to. And so in our community, for the Catholic community, even that obviously the Tre, the focus of the three kings,
Yeah.
is celebrated in our area. So it's neat. I was once part of something where, and I was quite disappointed. We were working with, I think in this case, it was the Puerto Rican community, and to kind of, I was running the parish at that time. It was about 9 years ago, and I'm reappointed recently, but I suggested that why don't we give within our midst the Puerto Rican community, everything they need, whether it's the parish hall, I could raise money,
Yeah.
but for them to lead us into their celebration. And I can't tell you what happened, Michael. And this is original sin. This is the fall. What they got people to do is they had non Puerto Rican people giving talks on this festival instead of celebrating it. It went totally left brain from people who weren't from that tradition.
And intellectual.
And then we had a cake. We had to find the little king in it, right? And it was so tokenistic.
Yep.
And I couldn't believe it. I had to walk out kind of in protest. I was so mad that I thought I'd empowered this kind of like how we can learn from, we have to imagine our impoverishment and learn to celebrate from people of a sharing of traditions. And it became a classroom, and it became the beneficiaries of the education became the people who lectured on it, a didactic history of this festival. And it was sinful.
It is sinful. And that's the problem. I mean, one of the problems with the way festivals are observed in the church these days, it's mostly an intellectual it's a concept.
Yeah, right.
It's not a practice.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I know, you probably did too, but I intuitively felt as a kid that there's something missing in these,
Yeah.
Though it was, I mean, like you said, I think the only exception to that was the May crowning. When the kids at school brought every lilac in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and we were stealing them from our neighbors' bushes.
Yeah.
It was just so much fun.
It was fun, and it meant something.
Yeah.
Right. And singing the Lord's hymn. I remember that at school. It was a wonderful experience. But that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, besides Easter and Christmas, right? Where the church always, pull out a couple stops for Easter and Christmas, but that was about it.
Yeah.
Outside of that, there was the church fair, which is a fundraiser, but it wasn't connected to anything liturgical.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
It was fun to go. I mean, I loved
so that would have been neat if the church fair if it had coincided with John the Baptist's birthday, if you had a huge bonfire and things like that.
There's something, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's the problem. I mean, another thing I think that served to disenchant the church here industrialization, right?
Of course.
And urbanization, right? So people are more and more disconnected from the land, but we know that people who are disconnected from the cosmos, they're given over to depression.
Yeah.
And they feel alienated from
Right.
the world, right? Which is,
I mentioned this Oswald Spengler before, and when he talks about the decline of civilizations, the rise and the falls, he has something of a checklist, and that we can go through it in our time. But it's to your point about cities and the disconnect. He doesn't talk about the rise of cities leading to the decline of civilization, but as one of his marks, and I'll say a few others, a military that doesn't reflect the populace, check. A fake intellectualism emanating from the cities, check.
check.
A disconnect between the cities and the countryside. It's not the growth of cities, but again, when they're disconnected, that's where they metastasize. It's not just on their own, but when you lose that harmonious thing that would keep the city in the right size, this, it's like anything. It's the push and pull factors, the embeddedness of cities within their matrix.
Right.
They get disembedded, then they grow to monstrous proportions. Then they become parasitic on the countryside. And Spengler knew at that point, you're seeing the decline of that civilization.
That's brilliant. And one of my touchstones is the rise of enclosure.
Absolutely.
And which happens, it happened in England, by just passing laws like throw people off the land. So what happens? People are thrown off the land. They have no place to go but the city, become wage earners, right? Which is William Cobbett, if you probably know him.
Yeah.
What a great figure that guy was, who railed against this practice because he thought, you only need a couple acres, and you can, and the secret to happiness is bread, beer, and bacon, right?
Yeah.
And
some of our listeners are probably screaming from their chairs, those who've had the good fortune to read Eamon Duffy's The Stripping of the Altars.
Yeah.
This is a seminal book that proved that on the eve of the Reformation, the story told is that these festivals were all desiccated, nobody cared. He points out that these things were vitally
Absolutely.
alive. That
Absolutely.
was one of the best books written in the last 40 years.
I think so.
Yeah.
And where was I going with this?
You were talking about William Cobbett and enclosure.
Well, yeah, enclosure. So what happened, and you can see this through this is the Industrial Revolution. So what happened? They passed in these enclosure laws to throw people off the land so they could go work in the factories, and which contributed to depression, alcoholism, prostitution, etc.
Yeah,
child labor, all these evils that came out of this movement. And where I live, what happens in a more subtle way, they just their methods become more sophisticated. So here what they do, and probably where you live too, is they sell farms to developers, which makes the taxes go up.
Yeah.
Then the other farms can no longer afford to keep their farms because the taxes are too high. They're forced to sell. That's enclosure.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. No, I think that you're one of the few people making that very clear in our time, how we're doing it again through those.
and that further disconnects people from the cosmos and from the soil, and only repeats that cycle of depression, alcoholism, drug use, etc.
Right. Well, as we head into Advent, you and I both share maybe some insights, and we can revisit this theme. Tara will join us, I'm sure. But let's just focus on maybe the Advent, Christmas, Epiphany cycle, and I'm afraid I'll probably be a little too left-brained, but I'm thinking of some of the distinctions. I was just at a church meeting that I've had several parishioners who mentioned that maybe on 60 Minutes and on PBS, I guess, maybe these are two different ones, but I've had links sent to me by many parishioners on TikTok, the special evil way this works on young people's brains is if screens weren't already destroying them,
right,
it would be like a generation getting drunk, then all of a sudden fentanyl comes in, right? And so I need to watch these, but I had a meeting at our parish 2 weekends ago, and it was convening parents on the issue of screens, right? And one of the things that was outlawed was like the phrase kids these days. But so in our parish, I was just having a meeting that we have adoration on Thursdays every week. And I felt when I attend adoration that during Advent, it's the most countercultural. That when I'm in a church as sun is setting, and Steiner or Emil Bach, one of his interpreters, talked about contrasting the holy rush of Advent versus the unholy rush.
Right.
That there is a rush even in our tradition, but the consumer one is an unholy rush. And it could be, creating a space, building a highway to our God, these images from Isaiah. But anyhow, mashing all those things up in our time, I was just thinking out loud with a coworker in pastoral ministry, how maybe instead of the opposite of kids these days, but if we could get parents to have just a techno fast on their own, from as soon as the afternoon hits, because we're not asking too much at this stage, maybe just from 4 o'clock to the end of that night, no screens, no phone or anything for the parents, and sitting in silence together. Joint renunciation is a big thing for my hero Ivan Illich.
Yeah.
As opposed to Lent saying, I'm giving up cigars, I don't smoke cigars, you're giving up this, we both beat ourselves up when we fail, or we have pissing contests and things like that. Joint renunciations of technology are very powerful. And I'm forgetting the anecdote from Gandhi, but there's a famous anecdote where his son, I guess, was doing something wrong and Gandhi paid the penance. So I'm kind of liking this image that in Advent, if we can get some parents to join in a techno fast, let's let the kids do their own thing for a while. We got to get our relationship with technology under control too. And I always tell people pastorally, whether it's this issue of codependency in a marriage or anything, the best thing you can do for that person you love is to show them you're working on something yourself, right?
Yeah.
So Advent, we're talking about stillness, and I plan to bring something like that to my own Advent. I also remember as we head into Christmas and Epiphany that Steiner, I'm not saying it's Steiner says, nobody gets into that, but he would say the backward lookingness towards Christmas might be needing to be counterbalanced or superseded in our time with the forward looking nature of Epiphany. And he had the feast of, New Year's Day, or Mary, the Mother of God, as it is, as kind of a Janus-headed feast, where we're kind of looking back to Christmas and forward to Epiphany. And, that I know that, if we want to get you to break something, we're going to mention to you how they've moved Epiphany to their Sunday, right? For all damning all your 12
Don't even
nights,
get me started.
Right. But and these books we mentioned, it can't be left brain and reading about them. But for some people have written to me saying, like, how do you get into this Steinerian corpus? Again, it came up. Guido was asked about like the 3 greatest writers, and he put Steiner up there again.
Yeah, I heard that.
And everybody wonders, how do you wade into this? But there's a series of books, and I don't know the press, but they're labeled like Michaelmas, Easter, Christmas, and they have selections from Steiner, with short little introductions. And this is a genius series.
That was Christopher. That was Christopher Bamford's work.
Was it his baby?
Steiner
Okay,
books, yeah. He did a great job
online.
of doing that.
They're cheap. And you can buy the one on Advent and buy the one on Christmas, and just use those as like fertilizing seeds for yourself. Do not take them as blueprints for things you have to implement, right?
No, and I like I mentioned, the 4 Seasons and the Archangels is a really good one. And you mentioned Emil Bach, which I just happen to have on my lap.
Which one does? Oh yeah, it's a great
The
book,
Rhythm of the Christian Year.
It's a great book. It's a great book.
And he, I mean, he's definitely an anthroposophist, but it's a
Lutheran minister, wasn't he?
Yeah, but he makes Steiner easy. He's a great translator of Steiner into common language. In a way, because you read Steiner and some people are like, okay, I have no idea what's going on here.
That's my favorite non-Steinerian book of Steiner in my library is Bach's book.
It's a good book.
Liturgical.
And it's useful. And in fact, I was looking through it before we started today, because it's so chock full of pithy insights.
Yeah.
Which is very useful and very. I mean, you can tell this guy was a serious, committed Christian.
Yeah.
He wasn't just some flake. You know what I mean? Emil Bach.
His book on Mary is one of the best books on Mary I've ever read. I don't know if it's called Threefold Garland or something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember what that's called. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so with Advent coming, it's this season of preparation, and really Advent started coming at Michaelmas.
Absolutely.
Right. And as you see here in the Northern Hemisphere, everything starts to retract, right? Where All Souls Day, and then Martinmas, which is a beautiful festival, which we usually do with the little kids. We don't have any little kids right now.
Lantern
We'll observe
walks.
it at home, but we have
Yeah.
lantern walks we've done it on the farm, or even when we lived in the city, we would do it there. And then it keeps moving deeper and deeper. And this is what the thing is, pardon me. And this is what I learned in the Waldorf school, is going into Advent is a kind of process of almost, I wouldn't say sinking, but concentrating.
Sure.
Where so you start from Michaelmas, which is a big festival about good versus evil, and Martinmas, which is the light against the darkness, and also the feast of Saint Lucy or Santa Lucia in December, and then finally get to the Christmas festival, right? So you've kind of just drawn in as this, and through Advent, and they did a wonderful thing at the Waldorf School, and they still do it. I don't know if they still do it because they're I think a lot of Waldorf schools have distanced themselves from Christ, but they used to do
it's their job.
Like,
yeah,
they used to do the Advent garden, which was really beautiful at the school I worked at. They would make a spiral of
the stones first,
like rope, no, like roping,
okay.
pine roping that people put on their houses or whatever, and make a spiral in this one room and have candles and crystals and pine cones and different things decorating, and the kindergarten kids would go in there.
I think that is still done.
Someone's playing the harp or the lyre or something, and they would make a little circuit through that spiral and out, which is just gorgeous.
Kind of like a labyrinth, or same
more like a spiral,
right?
not like a labyrinth,
okay,
more like a spiral.
Yeah.
A double spiral, so you can go in and out without turning around, right? And when I taught, a couple times they would have,
I forgot
they usually had somebody playing the lyre, but sometimes they would have a small group singing, which was gorgeous, and this is the thing, is the way we do it in our culture, it's so damn superficial, and it's like a Walt Disney movie 24/7, and we don't know how to bring children to reverence.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the great gifts of Rudolf Steiner was he emphasized it in teaching. We must learn how to bring the child to reverence, because if a child cannot become to reverence, as a child, he'll never be able to raise his hand in blessing as an old man. Right. So I think that's important, learning how to bring, and because I think children have a natural affinity for reverence. And one thing Steiner points out, and you can read it in Goethe's autobiography, he talks about when he was a little boy and he took this music stand and he made it an altar to nature, which kids just naturally do.
Yeah.
Right? They want, they have a special place where they have this special rock they found, or a pine cone or something. It's a innate religiosity that
we're going to be doing a show on the secret commonwealth soon, but again, that's when I can't think of that without thinking of how, especially my oldest daughter, who I'll be seeing this weekend in New York City, she spontaneously, my wife knew how to teach crafts to kids like nobody, but the way Mary would find moss and put it here and then do this, and she was creating things that she had no template for, but she was creating fairy houses before she knew what fairy houses were.
Yep, my kids did the same thing.
Yeah, and that's, you just wonder. But that spiral for Advent, have people look that up too. I could bring that to our local church too, just outside.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Outside the church at Adoration, some Thursday.
And it's, how could and how, and that's, I think with the idea with festivals, for me, and this is actually this is why I said it. My mom's passing reminded me of this, because there's both reverence and carnival involved, right? So when my mother was dying, when she died, it was that we were in a moment of reverence, and it was beautiful with all my nieces and nephews and sisters. But then it went to carnival, almost spontaneously and right away.
Right.
And then it went back to reverence.
Yeah.
Same thing when we do when we do Michaelmas, for instance, it gets to, when we have the parade with the dragon meeting Saint Michael at the top of the hill behind my house. It's joyful, but it's serious at the same time. There's an interesting mood that permeates that. And then after that, we say grace and we go into the barn and have a feast, and it's joyous, right? So you have to have both
Yeah.
in these, you have to have reverence and celebration, or
Mhm.
the carnival aspect of it. It has to be there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't have a range.
No. I
One of
can
the things.
echo that. I just took some college students on retreat at a Franciscan retreat center this weekend, and having worked at a Trappist monastery too, I was the retreat director. That a typical college retreat, at least this one, has like chapel time where you're very serious. Then we might have a grand silence on Saturday afternoon, but the meals are hysterical, right? Whereas the
Yeah,
Trappist retreat house, and I love this, don't get me wrong, and I still need those kind of silent retreats myself, but the meals were all taken in silence. But a typical college retreat where everybody's got these inside jokes that keep on growing and growing,
right.
and you're laughing hysterical, and you're not talking about anything religious, and you're cutting on people. Then all of a sudden, the second night, and you haven't met some of these people before, you're back in chapel again, and the social plays off the reverend
Yeah,
just builds over the course of the weekend. This was an intercollegiate retreat, so we met people from different colleges, and that same pattern you're talking about builds and builds and builds, and they both reinforce one another. You know.
right. And
Yeah.
and that was one of the things, and this is what I think the Protestant Reformation tried to squash that, right? So the range was like this,
Uh-huh.
and it tries to squash the range to this, to try to keep it under control.
Yeah.
And one of the big complaints prior to the Reformation in England was that the Whitsun festivals were getting too out of hand.
Yeah.
That's why they call it a Whitsun ale. And
Uh-huh.
Whitsun ale, because that was when the beer is ready. Okay, let's try it out. Let's take it for a spin. And people didn't like that there was some busybodies who didn't like that people were having too much fun.
Yeah.
And Ben
Yeah.
Jonson makes a fun of a lot of this in his plays. He excoriates the Puritans in particular, because they were big party poopers.
Yeah.
And you have to think, who are the party poopers in our culture who are trying to squash all that?
Silicon
Because
Valley.
it's both spiritual and convivial, right?
Yeah.
So there's a spiritual or a otherworldly element to it, but there's also this great convivial, joyful, celebratory element to it. But who's trying to squash that for us?
Well, how about flip the coin, and that old logoi, or commonplace, that living well is the best revenge. That one of the it kind of captures the same thing. So can we name these people? The elites or whatever, but there seems to be something draining the fun out of the world.
Well,
But also the best revenge is celebrating these things is a great punch back in the face.
That's right. So
That's kind of what I guess how the Grinch stole Christmas, right?
the take home, even if you're not religious, do it to get back at the man. Yeah,
absolutely. Another great literary reference. I don't think I can let an episode go past without mentioning John Cooper Powys, but if people want to see a great literary reference to festivals, and I mentioned before the feminine nature, according to this author Christian Roy, of like haggling in the marketplace, that got replaced with the fixed price,
right,
as being something of the death of festivals, is in the beginning of a masterwork. Owen Glendower. Glendower was this great Welsh revolutionary around the year 1400, and the novel begins on St. John's Day, and Trappist monks and marketplaces and vagabonds and monks all interacting, and it's a wild couple of opening chapters. If you don't even read the rest of the book, it makes you hungry to see all these interconnections that we're talking about, right? And again, we could bring commerce isn't bad. We know that commerce is a great word, the circulatory nature, but the way the economy has been disembedded, from the rest of culture, and it has its own world, the economy. This is stuff of the Antichrist, folks. So if we can re-embed the economy back into our festivals and humanize them, right? It used to be, we knew the power. People think, oh, we didn't know the power of the market. Carl Polanyi is the great historian of this. No, we knew the power of it. We just limited it to to these days, like on Saturday from 12 to 3 in this space. And we
Yeah.
surrounded it with conviviality. When
We
it got
yeah.
disembedded and then everything had a market price, that was the end of the world, right?
We scaled
So
it
the
to the
Protestant
human.
Reformation and the
Yeah.
disembedding of the market could be two
Yeah.
of the stink bombs to fun in this whole world, right?
Like, and you know, I'm sure you know this book, Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I know the
It's
title.
really good. I mean, he's
Yeah.
really good about this, and I
What's
think
the premise
he's
there?
right
That
in the
same
money.
type of stuff.
The
huh?
same that the disenchantment of the world,
Yeah.
and the rise of this kind of atheistic capitalist, you know, rapacious thing
Yeah.
that all belongs to to the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
You know, own it. You got to own this. This
Yeah,
is your
and the reason I
baby.
mention it, right? Because when we go into Advent, we were talking about it. Again, the language, doesn't it sound tinny now? We need like the enemy is consumer Christmas. And I went, okay, that's too easy. I get your point. But again, the marketplace, non-usurious, non-fixed price. The marketplace, if you go to these Christmas markets in Europe, you see
Right.
how the market can be tied to like wonderful Christmas sensibilities.
Well, it can be,
right?
but that's the
Yeah.
whole thing. The word economy means household.
Yeah, right.
So if once the economy is divorced from the household,
Yeah.
it's pathological.
It's like the difference between when you write on pornography, nobody wants to condone necessarily any of it. But the difference between, driving to the seedy side of town and going to a strip club and seeing a lady's boobs versus the only for the lonely consumption of internet pornography, right?
Right.
Same thing, Amazon getting the Black Friday deals on Amazon as opposed to going to a Christmas market and having some mulled cider and walking around and seeing your neighbors.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. The language of consumer Christmas, it confuses as much as it illuminates.
And I think in a few weeks we're going to have a show on distributism, which is, I mean, this is what we're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you make an economy human?
Yeah.
Right? How do you do that? And without going backwards.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, maybe it will happen, not to get too off track, but what does John Michael Greer call it? Deindustrialization.
Yeah.
Right. With that, I think that's probably somewhat inevitable. I don't know if it is, but I like the idea.
Yeah.
And but do people think what it would be like to live in a more self-sufficient way? Which is interesting because there are a lot of, I don't want to get too off track here, but a lot of people who, are trying to live off grid and things like this. I think much of what they're doing, I can't speak for all of them, but is not trying to unplug from society as much as trying to find an authentic way to live.
Fair.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing. And I'm lucky where I live. We encounter a lot of people like this who will get raw milk from us, or and most of them are involved in other things as well. Like there's one of the people who's studying naturopathic medicine. There's another one who, when we go to these reenactments, she actually makes these brooms, which are awesome. Like broom made of broom, right?
Yeah. These are the real deal.
And we bought one from her. That's how we got to be friends with her. And so I think I told you a couple of weeks ago I was tanning one of our sheepskins, which I finished the job. Actually, it's a rug now. It's awesome, and we have it in front of the stove. But those kinds of things, even if you don't do it, 100, in such a small percentage of the way we live, but those kinds of things connect you to the real, right? Which help you, first of all, you appreciate how hard it is to do things. But the other thing is you're connected to real things. And when you're connected to real things, like you were talking about the fasting from the tech during Advent, right? As a family, for instance. But you do real things, you're naturally disconnected from the internet,
right?
Because you're involved in the real world. Like our friend, our mutual friend and frequent contributor to Jesus the Imagination, Tyler DeLong, is a phenomenal woodworker.
Beautiful stuff.
He's a brilliant theological thinker, but he's also an extraordinary woodworker. And the man is connected to the real through that
all
art,
the
that
time. I
craft,
wonder if
right?
he's ever not connected to the real. When he's
Yeah,
not carving, he's out in the woods and his kids are fishing on streams, and
yeah.
that's great. Yeah, I also,
So
if people, as if they needed another reason, but all this stuff is the antidote for anxiety, right?
absolutely.
You know,
And that's the thing. I mean, and civilization is a sickness.
yeah,
Well, you know what I mean? I mean, the economy, the household, which we can extend to, our friends and neighbors, is not a sickness,
hmm
at least, right? It's not pathological, but you get to a bigger scale, like you're mentioning with Spengler when he talks about the growth of cities.
yeah.
Eventually, it gets to a pathological state, and then it implodes.
If we have any listeners who know, we just mentioned bigness there. It's a huge theme of mine, but the a guy that, and maybe for the name Leopold Kohr, he has a book, The Breakdown of Civilization, or The Breakdown of Culture, or The Breakdown of something. But he was one of Illich's favorite thinkers, Leopold Kohr. So if any listeners know of a Kohr scholar, he's somebody we have to have on. But Kohr would say there's only one problem: bigness. When things grow out of their shape, he would point out that picture a little, hobbit house, cute. But if you took that and you took it out of scale, so you just saw it, across the hills and it was huge, it looks, ugly.
Yeah.
And that we've lost the ability to talk about scale. Today's election day. Let's not wade into those waters. But the problem with election day is we've lost the scale for democracy. You and I have both taught humanities. And as far as we know, other than an attempt by David Hume to map it onto larger systems, no theorist of democracy ever thought it could work beyond like 1 to 10,000 in terms of representatives to vote, or the size of a city you could walk across in one day.
Yeah.
And yet here we are having a conversation about the loss of our democracy when my congressperson represents over 1 million people. Like, I want to say that ship sailed a long, long time ago. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll touch on that when we talk distributism in a few weeks too.
Yeah. Scale. So I think, because we'll be revisiting this theme, I don't think it's wrong for us to kind of pull it to a close at this
And
point.
I think we can't finish without, since you mentioned scale.
Yeah.
I mean, the classic text on the subject, "Small is Beautiful,"
Right,
by Schumacher, right?
Yep.
Which I think, he was so far ahead of the game.
Yeah.
He saw it coming. Was that written in the 50s or early 60s?
I forget when.
It's a long time ago.
I have a copy right behind me.
Yeah, I do too. I'd have to get up.
I'm looking. That students always watch me look for books. When you need them, you can't find them on your shelf. When you're at home.
And the other thing, one thing I want to mention now, one book that was super helpful when I was tearing the house apart looking for it, about festivals and celebrating the year, and I don't remember the name of it. And I think it was by Caitlin Matthews.
I do. Yeah, she's
the
got
Grail
stuff on Celtic
lady.
stuff. Yeah,
Celtic stuff. I think it was by her. It might not have been by her, but it was a cool book about celebrating the year. And I looked on her Amazon page and I didn't see it
because it has a Celtic name. I think I know the one you're talking about.
They may have rebranded as a Celtic name. I might have had an older edition.
Yeah, because it's all about Beltane and all these things, but it's easily mapped on to the traditional Celtic.
Oh yeah,
grid.
But the thing is, what was cool about it, and this is what I would like to do if I ever do a book like this, it had recipes as well as things you can do. So how do you make a 12th night cake? Or I think actually it was for the May Day or for his Michaelmas. There was a great recipe for making cider, hard cider, which was the first time I tried my hand at fermentation 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So
and
that's what was great. I mean, that's because that's the practical stuff is what do you do? How can I do this stuff? Right. And I think that's even more useful than the intellectual stuff, which is useful.
And
certainly.
Again, so decidedly non-intellectual as this book I mentioned earlier. It's short. I tend to read at home, and I have a dog crate next to me. That we have a small dog. It's big, and it's always there. But it's a small little book. I think generally they still charge you like $20 for it online. But it's Rudolf Steiner's Calendar of the Soul.
Yeah.
So each week, it says, for example, like October 7th through the 14th. And it has about 3 lines. The version I have has the translations from Owen Barfield.
Right.
But this would begin the whole process we're talking about with this cycle from inwardness to ecstasy, from inwardness. And even his ecstasy, as you know, it contains more inwardness than the old solstice festivals, the purely pagan ones. But that's another, we might have temperaments listening to us that want to begin right within their own body. And this is where Steiner begins. If we can, it's almost like we can start to recognize the festivals within our own body,
Right.
specifically within our own breathing process.
Now we started with talking about my mom.
Yeah, tell me.
And I would like to end not about my mom, but something that I was, when I was looking through the email box, The Rhythm of the Christian Year, which he said in one of the later pages. And I think this really bears import on what we've been talking about. Here's what he says. The event on Golgotha is for Michael, first and foremost, a key to all the portals of the future. He wants us to recognize that every rightly accomplished death moves humanity forward. Every inner suffering bears fruit. Thus, life constantly blossoms forth from death. Right, and it's not just my mother's death, but this is what the whole idea of celebrating the Christian year is. Right, this is what the agricultural cycle is.
Yeah.
Right, and I
again,
think
a rightly lived death is the opposite of all this, what I call embroidering lace on the void, all the stuff we do with conceptual thoughts and scholastic theology and everything. A rightly lived death.
And that, and I think, what the oldest line in philosophy is, right? Philosophy is learning how to die.
Yeah, right.
Right. But I think we might even say that because of our fear of not even confronting death, but being with death. And this is a Heidegger, right? But this is, I know this was my mother, the sacred experience of my mother's death, which is, I'm 60 years old. It took me that long to do this.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And it was a sacred moment, and it like Bach says, there are seeds of other things there, right? There's the seeds of the future. We're there, just like in the celebration of the living and dying of the year, we can call it, right? Or the living and or the death and resurrection of Christ, right?
For sure. So
anyway,
condolences to you again, my friend, and to the House of Martin.
Thank you
again. I think this was the right thing to talk about. You were in the zone, and again, like, to celebrate a life well lived is to tie in the microcosm within the macrocosm. So yeah. I'll be holding you all in prayer this week.
I appreciate that.
Funerals tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay. God bless you, my friend. Yeah, we'll see everybody next week on the Regeneration podcast.